A Hell's Angel stopped for his only daughter at the train station. What she said changed everything. The rumble of Jack Callahan's motorcycle cut through the misty morning air as he guided the machine along familiar curves. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gray. He'd chosen this route countless times before, always for the same reason. It kept him moving, kept him from staying still long enough for the past to catch up. His leather jacket creaked as he leaned into a turn, the sound mixing with the steady thrum of the engine. The empty road stretched ahead like an old friend, one that never asked questions or expected answers. Jack preferred it that way. 20 years of riding had taught him that forward motion was the closest thing to peace a man like him could find. Fields of wheat swayed on either side of the highway, their golden heads bowing in the early morning breeze. Jack's eyes scanned the road ahead, a habit born from years of watching for trouble. Even now, with his club days long behind him, old instincts died hard. The weight of his past sat heavy on his shoulders, like the leather jacket he couldn't bring himself to replace. A billboard flickered past. "Welcome to Mason Creek, population 2,187. Jack's grip tightened imperceptibly on the handlebars. This was Emily's town now, where she'd made her own life away from the shadows of his history. He usually skirted the edges, never stopping, just checking from a distance that everything looked peaceful. It was better that way. Safer. The less he lingered, the less chance his past had of finding its way to her door. The morning air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of fog. Jack's mind wandered to the rules he'd lived by since leaving the Angels. Keep moving, stay alert, trust no one but family. These weren't just rules. They were survival, learned the hard way through years of watching others pay the price for standing still too long. His phone vibrated in his jacket pocket, the sensation almost lost in the motorcycle's rumble. Jack never stopped for calls or messages. Another rule. But this morning, something made him ease off the throttle, guide the bike onto the shoulder of the road. Maybe it was the early hour, or maybe it was the way the wheat fields reminded him of Emily's hair catching the sunlight when she was young. With gloved hands, he pulled out his phone. One new message from Emily. His heart stumbled over its rhythm as he read, "Dad, please stop at the train station just once. I need to see you." Jack sat there, the bike idling beneath him, her words burning into his mind. 20 years of never stopping, never looking back, all challenged by 9 simple words from the one person who could make him question everything. The morning breeze carried the scent of diesel and steel from the nearby tracks, mixing with the familiar leather and oil that had become his constant companions. His thumb hovered over the phone screen. The rule was clear. Never stop. Never linger. It had kept them both safe for so long. But Emily's words held something he couldn't ignore, a need that spoke to the father in him rather than the ex-biker. After what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than a minute, Jack typed back a single word. "When?" The response came immediately. "Now." Jack Callahan, who hadn't broken his own rules in 2 decades, watched his hands turn the handlebars. The bike responded smoothly, banking into a turn that would take him toward the Mason Creek train station. For the first time in years, he was choosing to stop, to stay still, to face whatever waited at the end of this ride. His daughter was asking, and that changed everything. The Mason Creek train station looked frozen in time, its red brick walls and wooden benches unchanged since Jack had last seen them 2 decades ago. He guided his motorcycle into the nearly empty parking lot, the engine's rumble echoing off the station's walls. A few cars dotted the spaces, a dusty pickup truck, a sensible sedan, a minivan with a family stick figure decal on the back window. Normal people living normal lives. Jack's boots crunched on the gravel as he dismounted, his movements careful and deliberate. The morning sun had grown stronger now, casting sharp shadows across the concrete platform. His eyes swept the area out of habit. Exit points, blind spots, potential trouble zones. Some patterns of thinking never quite went away, no matter how many peaceful years passed. Through the station's weather-worn archway, he could see the platform clearly. Emily stood alone near the far end, a single-wheeled suitcase at her feet. She wore a blue dress that caught the breeze, her blonde hair pulled back neatly. The sight of her made his chest tighten. Even from this distance, he could see how much she resembled her mother. The same quiet grace, the same way of holding herself like she was braced for whatever came next. Jack paused in the archway, letting his shadow fall across the sun-warmed concrete. A train whistle sounded in the distance, lonely and haunting. The sound carried memories of other stations, other departures, times when staying still meant danger. But this was different. This was Emily. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her attention was focused on something in her hands. A phone, maybe, or a ticket. Jack took the moment to study her, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing down the tracks. Something wasn't right. He'd learned to read people's bodies for signs of trouble, and his daughter was carrying worry in every line of her posture. His boots made solid sounds against the platform as he approached. Emily turned at the noise, and their eyes met. A small smile touched her lips, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You came," she said simply. "You asked," Jack replied, his voice rough from the morning ride. The wind picked up, sending a paper skittering across the platform. Emily tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture he remembered from her childhood. She'd do the same thing when she was working up the courage to say something important. "Dad," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion he could see building behind her eyes. "Will you sit with me, just for 5 minutes?" The request hit him like a physical force. It was their old ritual, from when she was small and the world got too loud. They'd find a quiet spot and just sit, no words needed, until she felt ready to face things again. He hadn't realized she remembered those moments. "Like we used to?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Emily nodded, gesturing to the wooden bench behind them. 5 minutes, she repeated softly. "That's all I'm asking." The metal bench was cold against Jack's back, even through his leather jacket. He sat with his usual stillness, hands resting on his knees, while Emily settled beside him. The space between them felt both familiar and strange. A memory surfaced. Emily at 6 years old, tiny hands pressed against her ears as the trains roared past, seeking comfort in their shared silence. The platform's wooden boards creaked beneath their feet. In the distance, the warning bells began their gentle chiming, announcing an approaching train. Emily's shoulders tensed slightly, an echo of her childhood response to sudden noises. Jack noticed, but didn't comment. Some habits stayed with you. He knew that better than most. "Remember how I used to count the cars?" Emily asked, her voice soft against the growing rumble of the approaching train. "1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi." Jack nodded. Never missed a single one. Those had been easier days, when solving his daughter's fears meant nothing more complicated than teaching her to turn scary sounds into games. The train thundered past them, its wheels clicking against the track joints in a steady rhythm. Emily didn't flinch anymore, hadn't for years, but Jack saw her fingers tighten slightly around the handle of her suitcase. The breeze from the passing cars stirred her hair, and for a moment he saw her mother in the way she held herself, straight-backed and composed. As the train's noise faded, leaving behind a hollow quiet, Emily turned to face him. Her eyes, so like his own, held a determination that made his stomach tighten. He recognized that look. It was the same one she'd worn when she'd told him she was moving out for college, when she'd decided to take that job in the city. It was the look that meant change was coming, whether he was ready or not. "I've accepted a position overseas," she said, her voice steady but gentle. "In London." The words hung in the air between them. Jack's fingers pressed harder against his knees, but his face remained unchanged. Years of practice had taught him how to keep his emotions hidden, though Emily had always been able to read him anyway. "When?" he asked, the word coming out rougher than he intended. "My flight leaves next week." Emily's hands were folded in her lap now, her knuckles white. This is our goodbye, Dad." The platform seemed to tilt slightly under Jack's feet. He'd known something was coming. Emily never asked him to stop without reason, but this hit harder than he'd expected. The finality in her voice told him this wasn't just another move, another temporary separation. "Last meeting," he repeated, testing the weight of the words. Emily nodded, her composure cracking just slightly. "Yes," she said softly. "It needs to be." Another train whistle sounded in the distance, closer now. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting their shadows sharp and dark against the platform. Jack could feel the vibrations of the approaching train through the bench, a tremor that seemed to match the unsteady beating of his heart. The station around them continued its morning routine. A ticket agent changing shifts, a young couple hurrying through the archway with coffee cups in hand, the steady tick of the ancient clock above the platform. Normal moments in a normal day, except for the quiet earthquake happening on this metal bench, where a father was learning that sometimes the hardest stops aren't the ones you make on the road. The afternoon sun crept across the platform, casting long shadows through the station's iron pillars. Jack sat motionless, his weathered hands still pressed against his knees. He gave a single nod, the same measured response he'd given to 100 difficult moments before. The movement was almost mechanical, a gesture learned from years of holding emotions at arm's length. Emily watched him, her eyes catching the subtle tightening around his jaw. She'd grown up studying these small signs, learning to read volumes in her father's silence. The platform felt emptier now, though people still moved around them, caught in their own rushing worlds. "You don't seem surprised," Emily said, adjusting the strap of her purse. Her voice carried the same careful control she'd inherited from him. Jack shifted slightly, the leather of his jacket creaking. "You've always been meant for bigger things." The words came out gruff but gentle, like sandpaper worn smooth with use. A passing cloud dimmed the sunlight, and Emily pulled her light jacket closer. The metal bench had grown warm beneath them, but she felt a different kind of chill. Her fingers found the edge of an old train ticket in her purse, one she'd kept as a reminder. "That's not why I'm going," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance. "It's not about bigger things." Jack turned his head slightly, catching the shift in her tone. The practiced calm in her voice had wavered, just enough to stir the protective instinct he'd carried since first holding her as a newborn. "Then why?" he asked, though something in him already knew he might not want the answer. Emily took a deep breath, smoothing her hands over her skirt. A train rumbled past on the opposite track, the noise filling the space between them. She waited until it passed, until the quiet settled again like dust after a storm. "Something's come up," she said carefully, choosing each word like stepping stones across troubled water. "Something from before, from your old life." Jack's shoulders stiffened imperceptibly. The sun had found them again, but he felt none of its warmth. His past, the one he'd worked so hard to outrun, lay coiled in those simple words like a snake in tall grass. "What do you mean?" His voice had dropped lower, carrying an edge of the man he used to be. Emily turned to face him fully now, her composure a mirror of his own practiced restraint. "The club," she said softly, naming the shadow that had followed them for 20 years. "There are some loose ends that never got tied up." The platform seemed to shrink around them, the casual noise of the station fading to a distant hum. Jack's hands had curled into loose fists on his knees, not in anger, but in an old reflex he thought he'd forgotten. "That life is done," he said, the words coming out flat and final. "Has been for decades." "I know, Dad." Emily's voice carried a gentleness that made his chest ache. "But sometimes the past doesn't know it's supposed to stay buried." A young mother walked past with 2 children, their bright laughter a stark contrast to the heavy air surrounding the bench. Jack watched them go, remembering Emily at that age, how simple protection had seemed then. "What aren't you telling me?" he asked, though the question felt like lifting a stone he'd rather leave untouched. Emily's fingers traced the worn edges of the train ticket in her purse, a nervous habit she'd picked up over the past few months. The afternoon light caught the silver threading in her father's beard as she gathered her courage. 3 months ago, I got a letter," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the words. "It was addressed to you, but it came to my apartment." She paused, watching his expression carefully. It had the club's old symbol on it. Jack's face remained stone still, but his eyes darkened like storm clouds gathering. "You should have brought it to me." "I almost did," Emily admitted, "but then I started digging, made some calls, asked questions." She smoothed her skirt again, a gesture that reminded Jack so much of her mother. "There was money involved, Dad. A lot of it." The platform seemed to grow quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A cool breeze rustled through Emily's hair as she continued. "Remember Tommy Reed, your old treasurer?" She watched recognition flicker across her father's features. "Before you left, he made some deals, used the club's name. Your name." Jack's jaw tightened. "Tommy's been dead 15 years. But his debts weren't buried with him." Emily's voice dropped lower, meant only for her father's ears. "He borrowed from some dangerous people. When he died, the club sorted most of it out, but there was one loan that slipped through the cracks. It had your signature on it." "I never signed anything for Tommy," Jack said, his voice carrying the edge of old steel. "No," Emily agreed softly, "but someone did. And these people, they don't care if it was forged. They just want their money." A train whistled in the distance, the sound long and mournful. Jack sat perfectly still, processing each word with the careful attention of a man who'd learned the hard way that details matter. "How much?" he asked finally. Emily shook her head. "It doesn't matter now." "How much?" The question came harder this time. 85,000, she said quietly, plus 20 years of interest. Jack's hands tightened on his knees, knuckles white beneath old scars. The sum hung between them like a storm cloud, dark and threatening. "That's why I'm telling you this now," Emily continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Because it's done. Handled." Jack turned to her sharply, really looking at her for the first time since she'd started speaking. Understanding dawned slowly across his weathered features. "What did you do?" The question came out rough, almost afraid of the answer. Emily met his gaze steadily. "I paid it. All of it. Last week." She reached out and placed her hand over his clenched fist. "I've been saving for years, Dad. Living below my means, making smart investments. When I found out about the debt, I knew what I had to do. Jack stared at her small hand covering his mind struggling to grasp the magnitude of what she'd done. The protection he'd spent decades maintaining had somehow been reversed. His daughter, his little girl, had reached back through time and cleaned up the mess he hadn't even known was there. "Emily," he started, but the words stuck in his throat. "It's over," she said simply. "Really over. That's what I needed you to know." Jack stood abruptly, his boots scraping against the concrete platform. The movement was sudden enough to startle a nearby pigeon into flight. His hands opened and closed at his sides, a fighter's instinct wrestling with 20 years of carefully maintained control. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "It wasn't your responsibility. It wasn't your burden to carry." Emily remained seated, watching him with the same steady patience she'd inherited from him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the platform, stretching their silhouettes into giants against the station wall. "Dad." "No." He turned to face her, his shoulders tight with tension. "You don't understand what you've done. These people, they're not—" He broke off, running a hand through his graying hair. "If something had gone wrong—" "Nothing went wrong," Emily said softly. "I was careful. I used lawyers. Everything was documented." Jack paced the length of the bench, each step heavy with guilt. "I should have known. Should have checked. All these years I thought walking away was enough." He stopped, looking down at his daughter. "You emptied your savings for my mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," Emily replied. "It wasn't even really your debt." "Doesn't matter." Jack's voice cracked slightly. "I'm your father. I'm supposed to protect you, not the other way around." A train rumbled past on the opposite track, its wind whipping Emily's hair around her face. She tucked it back patiently, waiting for the noise to fade. "Do you remember why you left the club?" she asked suddenly. Jack's expression shifted, old pain surfacing in his eyes. "You know why?" "Tell me again." He sank back onto the bench beside her, the metal creaking under his weight. "Because I couldn't be both," he said finally. "Couldn't be your father and—" He gestured vaguely at his leather jacket, at the past it represented. "You chose me," Emily said simply. "You walked away from everything you knew, everything that made you feel safe and powerful." She turned to face him fully. "You did it without violence, without revenge. You just left, quietly. Started over." Jack stared at his hands, remembering how strange they'd felt without brass knuckles, without the weight of weapons. "Had to," he muttered. "For you." "And that's why I did this," Emily said, her voice growing stronger. "Not because I had to, not because I was afraid." She reached out and took one of his rough hands in both of hers. "I did it because you taught me what real loyalty looks like. Not blind obedience or blood oaths or revenge. Real loyalty is choosing love over fear." Jack's throat tightened as he looked at their joined hands, his scarred and weathered, hers smooth but just as strong in their own way. "When you walked away from the club," she continued, "you showed me that sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting. Sometimes it's just letting go, choosing peace." A gentle squeeze of his hand emphasized her words. "I learned that from you, Dad. Everything I am, everything I know about courage and loyalty, I learned it watching you choose to be my father instead of their brother." The words hit Jack like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He sat there, stunned by the reflection of his own choices in his daughter's actions, seeing for the first time how his decision to walk away had shaped more than just his own life. The station speakers crackled to life, a metallic voice announcing the arrival of the 6:15 to Hartford. Jack barely registered the words, still processing the weight of Emily's revelation. The setting sun painted the platform in shades of amber and purple, softening the harsh edges of the metal benches and worn concrete. "All these years," he said quietly, "I thought I was protecting you by staying distant, by being ready to disappear if trouble came." He shook his head slowly. "But you weren't afraid of my past at all, were you?" Emily adjusted the strap of her shoulder bag, a small smile touching her lips. "I was never afraid of your past, Dad. I was proud of how you changed it." A cool evening breeze swept across the platform, carrying the scent of diesel and late summer flowers from the station's small garden. Jack watched as Emily stood, stretching slightly after sitting so long on the hard bench. "The debt's really gone?" he asked, his voice still carrying a trace of disbelief. "Every penny," Emily confirmed. "Legally documented and witnessed. They can't come back for more." She paused, then added softly, "You're free now, Dad. We both are." The words settled over him like a blanket, warm and unexpectedly comforting. For the first time in decades, Jack felt the constant tension in his shoulders begin to ease. The weight he'd carried since leaving the club, the fear of consequences, the guilt of his past, the constant readiness for trouble. It all seemed lighter somehow. "When's your flight?" he asked, standing as the train's headlight appeared in the distance. "Not for 2 weeks," Emily replied, checking her phone. "I'm taking the train to Hartford tonight to stay with Sarah while I finish the paperwork. Then Montreal, then Paris." She looked up at him. "I'll write, actually write, not just text." The train was slowing now, its brakes squealing softly. Jack nodded, trying to find the right words. 20 years of guarding his emotions made it hard to speak, but Emily deserved to hear it. "I'm proud of you," he managed finally. "Not just for what you did, but for who you are, for understanding things I never could explain." Emily's eyes glistened in the fading light. She stepped forward and hugged him, pressing her face against his leather jacket like she used to do as a child. Jack held her close, memorizing the moment. "I learned from the best," she whispered. The train doors hissed open. Emily stepped back, picking up her small suitcase. "Same time next week?" she asked. "Before I leave for good?" Jack nodded, his throat too tight for words. He watched as she boarded the train, finding a window seat where she could wave to him. As the train began to move, he raised his hand in farewell, standing perfectly still until the last car disappeared around the bend. The platform felt suddenly empty, but not in the hollow way he'd feared. Instead, there was a sense of possibility in the gathering dusk, like the first breath after a long-held wait is finally set down. Jack remained there for a moment longer, watching the sunset paint the clouds in shades of gold and pink. Then, with deliberate movements, he turned toward the parking lot where his bike waited, knowing that for the first time in years, he wasn't riding to escape. He was riding toward something new. The motorcycle's engine purred softly as Jack cruised down familiar back roads, his speed unusually measured. Streetlights began flickering to life in the growing dusk, casting intermittent pools of yellow light across the asphalt. For the first time in years, he wasn't scanning the mirrors for trouble or planning escape routes. His mind was full of Emily's words, echoing with each mile marker he passed. The cooling evening air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and late summer flowers through his helmet. Jack noticed details he usually missed. The way shadows stretched long across cornfields, how the sunset painted the clouds in deep oranges and purples, the peaceful sight of porch lights coming on in farmhouse windows. "I learned from the best," Emily had said. The words settled deep in his chest, warming places that had been cold for too long. All these years, he'd thought his past was a burden she'd inherited. Instead, she'd seen something in his choice to leave the club that he'd never fully recognized himself. A deer bounded across the road ahead, and Jack easily slowed to let it pass. There was no tension in his shoulders, no instinct to accelerate away from imagined threats. The bike responded smoothly to his relaxed grip, different from his usual white-knuckled control. Houses began appearing more frequently as he approached town, their windows glowing with early evening light. He passed the diner where he sometimes grabbed coffee, the hardware store where he bought parts for the bike, the small park where he used to push Emily on the swings. These places had always felt temporary to him, like props in a play he might need to abandon at any moment. Now they looked more substantial, more real. The bike's headlight swept across his driveway as Jack made the final turn toward home. The small house sat dark and quiet, exactly as he'd left it that morning, though everything else felt different now. He guided the motorcycle to its usual spot, the engine's rumble falling silent as he cut the ignition. For a long moment, Jack sat on the bike, letting the evening settle around him. Crickets chirped in the overgrown grass beside the garage. A neighbor's wind chimes tinkled faintly. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked at nothing in particular. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. He removed his helmet and hung it on the handlebar, then pulled out his keys. The front porch light buzzed to life as he flipped the switch, illuminating worn wooden steps that needed painting. Inside, the house was cool and still. Jack's boots made familiar creaking sounds on the old floorboards as he walked to the kitchen. Without turning on the overhead light, he sank into a chair at the small table where he and Emily used to eat breakfast. Moonlight filtered through the window, casting pale squares on the linoleum floor. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking time in a way that didn't feel threatening anymore. Jack placed his keys on the table's scratched surface. They made a quiet, metallic sound that seemed to echo in the empty room. His leather jacket still held the warmth of the day's sun, but he didn't remove it yet. Instead, he sat in the gathering darkness, letting himself feel the full weight of change that had begun with a simple text message that morning. Jack pushed back from the kitchen table, his chair scraping against the linoleum. The darkness had deepened, but he didn't bother with the lights. Instead, he made his way down the narrow hallway to the small storage closet he never opened. His hand hesitated on the tarnished brass doorknob before turning it with purpose. The hinges creaked as the door swung open. Cardboard boxes, weathered and dusty, sat stacked in the shadows. He reached up to the highest shelf, fingers finding the one he needed by touch alone. It was lighter than he remembered as he carried it back to the kitchen table. This time he did switch on the light. The sudden brightness made him squint as he set the box down. Faded marker writing on the side read simply, "Before." Jack stared at his own handwriting from years ago, remembering the day he'd packed these things away. His hands were steady as he opened the box. The leather vest lay on top, still heavy with memories. The patches had been removed, but their outlines remained like scars in the material. He lifted it out and caught the lingering scent of motor oil and leather conditioner. Beneath the vest, a stack of old photographs spilled across the table. Jack spread them out with careful fingers. Younger versions of himself stared back, surrounded by men he'd once called brothers. Their faces were familiar as his own reflection, though he hadn't seen most of them in decades. One photo caught his eye. It showed him standing beside his bike, arm thrown around another rider, Tommy "Ghost" Martinez, the club's treasurer back then, the man who'd always known where every dollar went, who owed what to whom. Tommy, who'd moved to Arizona but still kept in touch with everyone who mattered. Jack picked up the photo, studying Ghost's familiar grin. If anyone knew about an old debt coming due, it would be Tommy. He'd always been the one who remembered everything, kept track of who paid and who didn't. More items emerged from the box. His old chain wallet, a bandana he'd worn on cross-country rides, patches he'd earned and later removed. Each object carried its own weight of history, but Jack kept coming back to that photograph, to Ghost's knowing smile and the ledgers he'd kept with religious devotion. The debt Emily had paid, it hadn't appeared from nowhere. Someone had kept that account open all these years, watching it gather interest like poison fruit. Someone had made sure it would eventually come due. Jack reached for his cell phone, scrolling through contacts he rarely used. Ghost's number was still there, unchanged after all this time. They spoke maybe once a year, usually around Christmas, keeping their conversation safely in the present tense. But Ghost would know. He always knew. The kitchen clock showed almost midnight, but Jack knew Tommy would be awake. The man had never slept before 2 a.m. in all the years they'd known each other. His thumb hovered over the call button as he looked again at the scattered remnants of his past life. Emily had paid a debt he hadn't even known existed. She'd carried that burden alone, protecting him just as he'd once protected her. The thought settled like a stone in his chest. Jack stood, gathering the photos and vest, returning them to their box. But he kept the picture of himself and Ghost out, propping it against the coffee maker. Tomorrow he'd make the call. Tomorrow he'd start finding answers. He needed to know who had reached out of the past to touch his daughter, who had forced her to carry his old weight. Ghost would know. He always did. The bell above Lou's diner chimed as Jack pushed through the glass door. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The familiar scent of coffee and bacon wrapped around him like a well-worn jacket. "Morning, Mr. Callahan," Sally, the teenage waitress, called out from behind the counter. Her smile was genuine, untouched by fear or judgment. She already had a coffee mug ready, knowing his routine. Jack nodded, settling into his usual booth by the window. The vinyl seat creaked beneath him, worn smooth by years of customers. He could see his bike parked outside, chrome gleaming in the early light. "The usual?" Sally asked, sliding his coffee across the table. Steam rose from the dark liquid like morning fog. "Thanks, Sally." His voice was rough from lack of sleep, but gentle. The girl reminded him of Emily at that age, eager to see the good in everyone. Other customers filtered in and out. Ted from the hardware store tipped his cap as he passed. Martha, who ran the flower shop next door, stopped to ask about his garden. They all knew who he was, what he'd been. But here, in this small town, they chose to see who he'd become instead. "Your eggs, Mr. Callahan," Sally said, setting down his plate. "Dad made them just how you like them." Lou himself emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. The diner owner had a way of knowing when someone needed to talk. He slid into the booth across from Jack, his bulk settling with familiar ease. "Saw Emily yesterday," Lou mentioned casually. "She stopped in before heading to the station, growing into quite the young lady." Jack pushed his eggs around with his fork. "She is." "Reminded me of when you two first came to town," Lou continued. "Must be, 15 years now? Right after that business with Marcus Reeves went down." Jack's fork stopped mid-motion. The name hung in the air like smoke, acrid and unwelcome. Marcus Reeves, the club's former enforcer, the man who'd specialized in collecting debts. Last Jack had heard, Marcus was doing time in Nevada. Lou seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. He studied Jack's face carefully. "Funny thing, Marcus's brother Danny was asking about you last week. Came through on his way to Chicago." The eggs turned to ash in Jack's mouth. Danny Reeves had been the club's accountant before Ghost took over. He'd worked alongside his brother, turning numbers into weapons, debts into chains. Didn't know Danny was out this way, Jack said carefully, his appetite gone. Neither did I, Lou replied, standing slowly. Thought you might want to know. Coffee's on the house today. Jack stared out the window at his bike, remembering Danny Reeves's neat handwriting in the club's books. The man had never forgotten a number or a name. The morning sun suddenly felt colder, its warmth unable to reach past the chill settling in Jack's bones. The diner's cheerful atmosphere continued around him, coffee being poured, plates clinking, casual conversation flowing. But Jack sat very still, his mind racing backward through years he'd thought safely buried. Danny Reeves. The name explained too much about Emily's secret payment, about debts that should have been long dead. Sally appeared with the coffee pot, her smile faltering slightly at his expression. Everything okay, Mr. Callahan? Fine, he managed, but the word tasted like a lie. Nothing was fine. Danny Reeves was asking questions, and Emily had paid a price Jack was only beginning to understand. A shadow from the past. Jack pushed open the diner's door, the bell's cheerful ring a stark contrast to the weight in his chest. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the last traces of dawn's softness. He dug in his pocket for his keys, ready to return home and sort through what Lou had told him. Iron Jack Callahan. The voice came from behind him, smooth as aged whiskey but twice as dangerous. Still riding that old Harley, I see. Jack's fingers tightened around his keys. He knew that voice. Would have known it anywhere. Slowly, he turned. Danny Reeves leaned against a sleek black sedan, his thin frame wrapped in an expensive suit that looked out of place in their small town. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He looked more like a banker than a former outlaw, but Jack knew better. Danny. Jack kept his voice neutral, stance relaxed, despite the tension coiling in his muscles. Long way from Chicago? Danny smiled, the expression never reaching his pale blue eyes. Just passing through. Thought I'd stop by, see how retirement's treating you. He gestured at the quiet street, the modest storefronts. Quite a change from the old days. That was the point. Jack stayed where he was, maintaining the distance between them. Through the diner's window, he could see Lou watching, phone in hand. Change is interesting, isn't it? Danny straightened his tie, a gesture Jack remembered from countless club meetings. Some things change completely. Others, he shrugged. Numbers, for instance. Numbers never really change. They just move around, shift from one column to another. Jack felt his jaw tighten. Emily's payment cleared the books. Oh, absolutely. Danny's smile widened fractionally. Your daughter's very thorough. Must have learned that from you. Taking care of business, handling things quietly. He pushed off from the car, taking a single step forward. But you know what's funny about books, Iron Jack? Even when the numbers balance, the story's still there. Every entry, every transaction, they all leave traces. The morning traffic continued around them, oblivious to the current of danger running beneath this seemingly casual conversation. A young mother hurried past with her child, the boy's laughter sharp and bright in the morning air. My time here is done, Jack said firmly. Has been for years. Danny spread his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. Of course it is. You're a model citizen now. Everyone says so. Even that nice waitress in there. He nodded toward the diner. But reputations, Jack, they're funny things. Like ink stains. Even when you think you've scrubbed them clean, they have a way of showing through. The threat was there, wrapped in politeness but unmistakable. Jack felt the familiar surge of protective anger, the instinct to eliminate any threat to his daughter. But that was the old way, the path he'd walked away from. "Is that all you came to say?" Jack's voice was quiet, controlled. "Just paying my respects." Danny straightened his cuffs, another remembered gesture from the past. "After all, we're still family, aren't we? Once a brother, always a brother." He smiled again, cold and precise. "Give my regards to Emily. Such a responsible young woman, taking care of her father's obligations." A call of warning. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he dialed Emily's number. The encounter with Danny still burned fresh in his mind, each calculated word a reminder of the world he'd left behind. He paced in his kitchen, boots scuffing against the worn linoleum, while the phone rang. "Dad?" Emily's voice came through clear and steady. "I was just thinking about you." Jack pressed his free hand against the counter, anchoring himself. "Emily." He cleared his throat, trying to keep his tone even. "How's the hotel?" "It's fine, small but clean. The bed's comfortable enough." There was a pause, and he could picture her sitting at the window, watching the world below. "What's wrong?" He should have known she'd hear it in his voice. She'd always been able to read him, even when he tried to hide his concerns. "Had a visitor today? Danny Reeves." The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats. "I see." Her voice remained calm, but he detected the slight edge of tension. "What did he want?" "To remind me that paid debts don't always mean finished business." Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. "Emily, I think you should change your plans. Maybe head west instead, or—" "Dad." She cut him off gently but firmly. "We knew this might happen. Danny's just flexing, showing he still has reach. But he won't do anything." "You don't know him like I do, sweetheart." The old nickname slipped out, carried by worry. "He doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." "No," Emily agreed, "but he respects power, and money talks louder than old grudges in his world. I made sure of that." Jack closed his eyes, leaning against the kitchen wall. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, warming his face, but he felt cold inside. "How did you get the money, Emily? The truth this time?" "Legal investments, smart planning, and a lot of overtime." He heard rustling, like she was settling into a chair. "I learned from you, Dad. Not the old you. The you who worked honest jobs, saved every penny, and taught me the value of patience." Pride warred with concern in his chest. "Danny mentioned you specifically. Said you were thorough." "Of course I was." There was a hint of steel in her voice now, reminiscent of his own. "I made sure everything was documented, witnessed, and legally binding. He can make threats, but he can't touch the settlement without exposing himself." "You thought of everything, didn't you?" "I had a good teacher." Her tone softened. "You taught me to plan ahead, to consider all angles. Remember when you used to quiz me about escape routes wherever we went?" Jack smiled, despite himself. "You always found at least 3. And I still do." She paused, and he heard cars passing on her end of the line. "I'm staying at the hotel tonight as planned. Tomorrow I'll head out, just like we discussed. Danny can't change that." "Emily, trust me, Dad. Like I trusted you all those years ago when you chose a different path." Her voice held no doubt, no fear. "I'll be fine. We both will be." Jack pressed his forehead against the cool wall, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest slowly begin to ease. "You're sure about staying tonight?" "Positive. I have some paperwork to finish, and I need the rest." She sounded confident, assured. Everything's going according to plan. The weight of distance. After hanging up the phone, Jack stood at his kitchen window, watching shadows lengthen across the backyard. Emily's calm confidence should have reassured him, but instead, it twisted like a knife in his gut. She was too much like him, willing to carry burdens alone, face danger head-on. He moved through the house restlessly, touching familiar objects as if they might anchor him. The framed photo of Emily's high school graduation, the leather jacket hung by the door, cleaned of all patches and markers of his past life. Each item held memories of choices made, sacrifices offered. In his small office, Jack pulled out the worn leather address book he kept locked in his desk. Names and numbers filled its pages, people who owed him favors, others who might still hold grudges. Danny's appearance wasn't random. Nothing in their world ever was. "Damn it," he muttered, closing the book with force. The afternoon light filtered through dusty blinds, casting prison bar shadows across his desk. He'd spent 20 years building walls between Emily and his past, and now those walls were crumbling. Jack paced the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the empty house. Every photo of Emily on the wall seemed to watch him. Her first day of school, soccer tournaments, college graduation. Each image marked a moment when he'd chosen to stay clean, to be the father she needed. But what if that hadn't been enough? In the living room, he sank into his old armchair, the leather creaking under his weight. The truth hit him like a physical blow. Emily had grown up learning to fight his battles. While he'd tried to protect her from his past, she'd been studying it, preparing for it. "Should have kept riding," he said to the empty room. "Should have never let her get close again." The words tasted bitter, but the logic felt solid. Every time he'd allowed himself to believe in peace, the past came roaring back. Danny's smirking face at the diner was proof enough. They were vultures, circling, waiting for weakness. And Emily was that weakness. Jack stood abruptly, moved to the window. The afternoon had deepened into that golden hour when everything looked softer, kinder. But he knew better. Kindness was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when it came to keeping Emily safe. His phone sat heavy in his pocket. One call could end this. Harsh words, a clean break. Tell her to go and not look back. Make her believe he didn't care enough to stay in touch. It would hurt less than whatever Danny and his kind might be planning. The decision crystallized in his mind, like ice forming over troubled waters. Emily was strong, capable, smart. She'd built a life far from his shadows. The kindest thing, the only thing he could do now was step back into those shadows where he belonged. Jack pulled out his phone, stared at Emily's last message. His thumb hovered over the delete button. Better to cut ties now, while she was already planning to leave. Better to push her away before Danny or someone else decided to use their connection as leverage. The afternoon light faded, leaving him standing in growing darkness. Tomorrow, he would start distancing himself. Tomorrow, he would begin the slow, deliberate process of becoming a ghost in his daughter's life. It would break something in him, but better his heart than her safety. He set his phone face down on the coffee table, each movement deliberate and final. Love, he reminded himself, sometimes meant letting go completely, even if it felt like tearing out his own heart. The neon sign of May's Cafe flickered against the evening darkness, casting alternating shadows of blue and red across the rain-slicked sidewalk. Jack arrived early, parking his bike where he could watch both the street and the entrance. Old habits died hard. Inside, the cafe was nearly empty. A few regulars hunched over their coffee cups, and soft jazz played from hidden speakers. Jack chose a booth in the back corner, positioning himself with his back to the wall. The vinyl seat squeaked as he settled in. "Your usual, Jack?" May herself approached, coffee pot in hand. Her gray hair was tied back in a neat bun, and her kind eyes crinkled at the corners. "Just black coffee?" he replied, his voice rougher than intended. May nodded and filled his cup without comment, sensing his mood. The bell above the door chimed, and Emily walked in, shaking water from her jacket. She spotted him immediately and made her way over, sliding into the booth across from him. Her overnight bag sat beside her, still packed. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, unwinding her scarf. Her face held that same determined calm he'd seen yesterday, the look that said she'd already made up her mind about everything. May appeared with a second cup of coffee. "Good to see you, Emily. Been too long?" Emily smiled. "Thanks, May. It really has." Jack watched the exchange in silence, steeling himself. Every fiber of his being screamed against what he was about to do, but Danny's warnings echoed in his mind. The cafe's warmth felt suffocating. "You didn't have to come back," he said finally, his words clipped and cold. "Could have just kept going." Emily's hands wrapped around her coffee cup, seeking warmth. "I wanted to see you again before I left. Make sure you understood why." "I understand plenty." Jack cut her off, forcing ice into his tone. "You stuck your nose where it didn't belong, made decisions that weren't yours to make." The hurt flashed across Emily's face before she could hide it. "Dad, please, I was trying to help." "Help?" He let out a harsh laugh that made a nearby customer glance over. "By what? Playing hero? Thinking you could fix everything with money and good intentions?" "That's not fair," Emily said quietly, her composure cracking slightly. "You taught me about loyalty, about protecting family. I taught you to stay out of dangerous business that doesn't concern you." Jack's knuckles whitened around his cup. Every word felt like swallowing glass, but he pressed on. "You want to leave? Fine. Go. But don't come back thinking you can fix the past." Emily sat very still, her coffee untouched and cooling between them. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the windows. "You don't mean that," she whispered. Jack forced himself to meet her eyes, to let her see nothing but cold determination. "I do. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Leave, Emily. Don't look back, don't call, don't write. Just go live your life and forget about all of this." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she blinked them back. She stood slowly, gathering her bag and scarf. For a moment she looked down at him, searching his face for some sign of the father she knew. "I love you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Even if you don't want me to." Jack said nothing, staring into his coffee as if it held answers. He listened to her footsteps moving away, the bell chiming as she left. Through the window, he watched her figure disappear into the rainy darkness, taking his heart with her. The cost of protection. Emily's hands shook as she folded another sweater, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The motel room's harsh fluorescent lights cast stark shadows across the bed, where her suitcase lay open, clothes scattered around it like fallen leaves. A car passed outside, its headlights sweeping across the wall and making her jump. She paused, pressing her palms against her eyes to stop the tears that threatened to spill over. The cheap digital clock on the nightstand blinked 9:47 p.m. in angry red numbers. "Focus," she whispered to herself, picking up another piece of clothing. But her usually precise folding was clumsy tonight, her movements mechanical and disconnected. The conversation at the cafe kept replaying in her mind, each cold word from her father cutting deeper with every remember. The room felt too quiet, too empty. She switched on the small TV mounted on the wall, needing something to fill the silence. A weather report droned on about incoming storms, matching her mood. Emily sat heavily on the edge of the bed, holding one of her father's old flannel shirts she'd borrowed years ago, and never returned. It still smelled faintly of motor oil and leather, scents that had always meant safety and home. Now they just made her chest ache. "It doesn't make sense," she said to the empty room. The father who had taught her to ride a bike, who had quit his old life to give her a better one, who had shown her that real strength came from walking away from violence. That man wouldn't push her away like this. Not without reason. Across town, Jack sat at his kitchen table, a glass of untouched whiskey in front of him. The house creaked and settled around him. Too big, too quiet without Emily's presence. Even though she hadn't lived here for years, her absence tonight felt different. Final. His phone lay dark and silent on the table. No messages, no calls. He'd made sure of that with his performance at the cafe. The memory of Emily's face, the hurt in her eyes, the trembling of her lips as she tried to stay strong, twisted in his gut like a knife. The whiskey caught the light from the overhead lamp, amber shadows dancing across the wooden table. Jack remembered other nights at this same table, helping Emily with homework, teaching her to play cards, listening to her dreams about college and travel, always being there, always protecting her. Until now. "Had to be done," he muttered, but the words rang hollow in the empty kitchen. Danny's warnings echoed in his mind, mixing with Emily's last words at the cafe. "I love you, even if you don't want me to." The clock on the wall ticked steadily onward. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. Jack's untouched drink gathered condensation, dripping onto the table in a steady rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He'd pushed away the one person who had seen past his mistakes, who had loved him enough to sacrifice her own safety to protect him. His daughter, who had learned loyalty not from his words but from his actions, until tonight, when he'd betrayed everything he'd ever taught her. Jack pressed his hands against the table, feeling the solid wood beneath his palms. The house had never felt more like a prison than it did now, filled with memories of a love he'd just thrown away. The cost of protection, he'd told himself. But as midnight approached and sleep remained distant, he wondered if the price had been too high. The first rays of sunlight crept through Jack's kitchen window, painting streaks across the table where he still sat. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, untouched like the whiskey from the night before. His eyes were red-rimmed from a sleepless night, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his mistake. The morning paper lay rolled up on the counter where he'd tossed it, another routine he couldn't bring himself to follow. Everything felt wrong, out of place, like the world had shifted beneath his feet. A bird chirped outside, the cheerful sound at odds with the hollow feeling in his chest. Jack rubbed his weathered hands across his face, feeling the rough stubble that had grown overnight. Emily's words from their first meeting at the station echoed in his mind. "I learned loyalty by watching you." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Pacing the kitchen, he stopped at the window overlooking his motorcycle in the driveway. The chrome caught the morning light, throwing back brilliant reflections that made him squint. "Protected her," he muttered, shaking his head. Some protection. His voice sounded strange in the quiet house, rough from disuse and emotion. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking another minute gone. Jack's eyes fell on the family photos lined up on the wall. Emily's graduation, her first bike ride, the day she got her driver's license. In every picture, she stood tall, confident, unafraid, just like he'd taught her to be. His gaze lingered on a photo of Emily at 16, arms crossed, standing in front of his motorcycle with a determined look he knew all too well. She'd just won an argument about taking a road trip together, refusing to let his concerns about his past stop them from making memories. "Damn it," he whispered, running his fingers through his gray, streaked hair. He'd spent years teaching Emily to face problems head-on, to stand up for what was right. Now here he was, pushing her away out of fear, betraying everything he'd worked so hard to instill in her. The morning light grew stronger, filling the kitchen with warmth he couldn't feel. Jack walked to the counter and picked up his phone, checking the time. 6:47 a.m. Emily's train would leave in just over an hour. An old receipt caught his eye, tucked under the coffee maker. It was from the diner where they used to have breakfast every Sunday, their special tradition. The sight of it hit him like a physical blow. He'd given up so much to protect Emily, walked away from a life of violence and power to give her something better. And now, when she needed him most, he was walking away again, not from danger, but from love. His hands clenched into fists, then slowly relaxed. The morning silence seemed to press in around him, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock and his own ragged breathing. Jack looked out the window again, watching as the sun climbed higher over the horizon. The same sun that would shine down on Emily as she boarded that train, believing her father had rejected her love and sacrifice. The thought jolted him into motion. He grabbed his leather jacket from the hook by the door, his keys jingling as he snatched them up. The weight of them in his hand felt different now. Not an escape route, but a way back to what mattered most. He had to get to the station, had to make this right, had to show Emily that the courage and loyalty she'd learned from him wasn't a lie. The morning light flooded the kitchen as Jack strode toward the door, determination replacing the regret in his tired eyes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the highway as Jack leaned into each curve, his motorcycle roaring beneath him. Rush hour traffic clogged the roads, forcing him to weave between cars with the kind of precision he hadn't needed in years. His heart pounded against his leather jacket, keeping time with the thrumming engine. A delivery truck changed lanes without signaling. Jack braked hard, his boots scraping pavement as he corrected his course. The close call sent adrenaline surging through his system, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Every second counted. Red brake lights flared ahead like warning signs. Jack downshifted, scanning for gaps between vehicles. A memory flashed, teaching Emily to drive, telling her to always leave herself an escape route. She'd absorbed every lesson, turning his hard-earned wisdom into something better, something kinder. Come on, he muttered inside his helmet as traffic crawled to a stop. The morning commuters sat in their cars, drinking coffee, checking phones, unaware of the weight pressing down on his shoulders. Jack flexed his cramping fingers on the handlebars, fighting the urge to gun the engine and split lanes at full speed. A gap opened between a minivan and a sedan. Jack took it, careful but quick, like threading a needle. More spaces appeared, and he moved through them with the focus of a man walking a tightrope. The station was still 3 miles away. His watch showed 7:32 a.m. The exit ramp finally came into view. Jack took it faster than he should, the bike tilting at an angle that would have terrified him if he'd had time to think about it. The familiar streets of the small town opened up before him, quieter than the highway but still dotted with morning traffic. Past the diner where he'd spoken those cruel words to Emily. Past the cafe where they used to share breakfast. Past the garage where he'd taught her to change oil, determined she'd never need to depend on anyone else. Each landmark stabbed at him with memories of what he'd almost thrown away. The railroad crossing gates started to lower as he approached. Without hesitation, Jack accelerated, shooting through just as the bells began to ring. The sound faded behind him, replaced by the urgent growl of his engine as he pushed the bike harder. Morning sunshine glinted off the station's windows ahead. Jack's throat tightened at the sight of cars in the parking lot, people hurrying across the concrete with briefcases and coffee cups. He swung into the first empty space he saw, killing the engine before the bike had fully stopped. His hands shook as he pulled off his helmet. The station clock read 7:41 a.m. Sweat dampened his gray hair despite the cool morning air. Jack's boots hit the pavement with purpose, his long strides eating up the distance to the platform entrance. He took the stairs 2 at a time, muscles protesting the sudden activity. The morning light streamed through the station's high windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The familiar sounds of announcements and rolling luggage filled the air. Jack burst onto the platform, his breath coming in short gasps. People turned to look at the leather-clad figure who'd appeared so suddenly, but he barely noticed them. His eyes swept the crowded space, searching. There, at the far end of the platform, Emily stood alone, one hand resting on the handle of her suitcase. She hadn't seen him yet, her gaze fixed on the tracks where her train would arrive. Jack's footsteps slowed as he approached Emily. The morning sunlight caught in her dark hair, reminding him of all the times he'd watched her grow from a tiny girl into this strong woman. His throat felt tight, years of stored words fighting to break free. A train whistle sounded in the distance, making other passengers on the platform shift and check their watches. Emily remained still, her posture straight and controlled, just like he'd taught her to be in uncertain moments. "Emily," he said softly, his voice rough from the morning ride. She turned, her face composed, but her eyes revealing a flash of surprise. The handle of her suitcase remained firmly in her grip, like an anchor keeping her in place. "Dad." Her voice was quiet, neither welcoming nor rejecting. Jack cleared his throat, his weathered hands hanging awkwardly at his sides. "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" Emily studied him, and he recognized the careful assessment in her gaze, another habit she'd learned from him. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a small nod. "The bench is empty," she said, gesturing to their spot from 2 days ago. They walked together, maintaining a careful distance. The metal bench was cold in the morning air, but Jack barely noticed as they sat down. Around them, the station buzzed with activity, but it felt distant, like background noise in a dream. "I was wrong," Jack said, the words coming out abruptly. "At the cafe, everything I said, I was wrong." Emily's hands folded in her lap, but she remained silent, waiting. "You paid that debt because you're stronger than I ever was," he continued, his voice growing steadier. "I spent years thinking the only way to protect you was to keep running, to stay tough. But you—" He shook his head, a hint of pride breaking through his gruff exterior. "You faced it head on. No violence, no threats, just quiet courage." The morning sun caught a tear in the corner of Emily's eye, but she blinked it away quickly. Jack recognized that too, his own stubborn refusal to show weakness. "I pushed you away because I was scared," he admitted. "Not of the old debts or the people from my past. I was scared because you did something I never could. You found a better way." An announcement crackled over the speakers, making them both jump slightly. Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying the weight of decades. "For paying that debt. For protecting me when I should have been protecting you. But mostly—" He turned to look at her directly. "Thank you for becoming someone better than your old man ever was." Emily's composure wavered, her lower lip trembling slightly. "You taught me how to be better," she said softly. "Every time you walked away from a fight, every time you chose peace over pride, I learned from watching you, Dad." Jack's vision blurred, and he blinked rapidly. "I was wrong to tell you to leave and not look back. I was falling back into old habits, thinking distance equals safety." He straightened his shoulders. "Whatever you decide to do now, wherever you choose to go, I want you to know I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry I forgot that even for a moment." The platform vibrated slightly as another train approached in the distance. Emily's hand moved across the cold metal bench, coming to rest next to his. Not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth between them. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the metal bench where Jack and Emily sat. A gentle breeze carried the scent of coffee from the station's small cafe, mixing with the metallic tang of train tracks and diesel. "There's something I never told you about the night I left the club," Jack said, his voice low enough that only Emily could hear. His weathered hands clasped together, knuckles white with tension. "It wasn't as clean as I made it sound." Emily turned slightly toward him, her movements careful and measured. She'd waited years for this story, knowing better than to push. "That night, they wanted me to—" Jack paused, swallowing hard. "They wanted me to hurt someone. Someone who hadn't done anything wrong, just gotten caught up in club business." His eyes fixed on a distant point, seeing something from long ago. "I'd done plenty of things I wasn't proud of, but this was different. All I could think about was you at home, probably reading one of those library books you loved so much." A commuter hurried past them, briefcase swinging. Emily stayed perfectly still, giving her father the space to find his words. "I knew if I did what they asked, I'd never be able to look you in the eye again. But saying no to the club?" He shook his head. "Nobody did that. The price was usually steep." Emily's hand moved slightly closer to his on the bench. "Is that why we moved so much when I was little?" Jack nodded. "First few years, I was always looking over my shoulder. Kept us moving, trying to stay ahead of any trouble. But you never complained. Just packed up your books and started fresh at each new school." "I remember the libraries," Emily said softly. "You'd always find the nearest one as soon as we got somewhere new. It was the only normal thing I could give you." His voice roughened. "When you told me about paying off that old debt, it hit me hard. All those years of running, trying to keep the past from touching you, and there you were, walking straight into it." A train thundered past on the opposite track, the rush of air lifting Emily's hair. She waited for the noise to fade before speaking. "Dad, I didn't pay that debt because I was scared. I did it because I finally understood something." She turned to face him fully. "You taught me that strength isn't about fighting or running. It's about choosing what's right, even when it's hard." Jack's eyes met hers, bright with emotion he rarely showed. "When I found out about the debt, I could have ignored it, could have run like we used to." Emily's voice grew stronger. "But that's not who I am anymore. That's not who you taught me to be." "I just want you safe," Jack admitted, the words coming out rough and raw. "I am safe," Emily said firmly, "and I'm not running away." She straightened her shoulders, mirror image of her father's stance. "This trip, this move, it's not about escape. It's about choosing my own path. I got a job offer overseas, a good one, the kind of opportunity I've worked for." Understanding slowly dawned in Jack's eyes as he studied her face. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "All these years," Emily continued, "you've been trying to protect me from your past. But Dad, you already did that. You protected me by showing me there's always another way. That's why I could handle that debt without violence or fear. That's why I can leave now, not running from something, but moving towards something better." The station clock ticked steadily above them, marking each moment of silence that followed her words. A mechanical whine filled the air as the train approached the station, its silver body gleaming in the morning light. The platform hummed with renewed activity as waiting passengers gathered their belongings. "Now boarding express service to Boston, track 3, a voice announced over the speakers, slightly tinny but clear. Jack shifted on the bench, his leather jacket creaking. The familiar urge to flee, to get back on his bike and ride until the moment passed, crept up his spine, but Emily's presence beside him kept him anchored. "You know," Emily said, watching the train slow to a stop, "I learned something else from you too." She stood up, smoothing her jacket with practiced calm. "I learned that sometimes the bravest thing isn't staying or going, it's knowing the difference." Jack rose beside her, his movements careful, measured. Around them, passengers began filing toward the train doors, a steady stream of briefcases and rolling suitcases. "The job in London," Emily continued, reaching for her own bag. "It's a 6-month contract, not permanent." She glanced up at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Did you think I was leaving forever?" The tension that had been coiled in Jack's shoulders for days began to loosen. "You didn't say, because I needed you to hear everything else first." Emily's voice was gentle but firm. "I needed you to understand that I'm not running away from your past or mine. That when I come back, and I will come back, it'll be because I choose to, not because I'm hiding." Another announcement echoed across the platform. "Final boarding call for express service to Boston Track 3. Jack stood very still, processing her words. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, highlighting the years etched in his face. 6 months, he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words, just long enough to set up their new accounting system. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag. "And maybe—" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Maybe long enough for both of us to stop looking over our shoulders all the time." A whistle blew, sharp and clear in the morning air. "Dad," Emily said softly, stepping closer. "I'm coming back, but I need to do this first. For me." Jack nodded, his throat working. Then, with movements that seemed to surprise them both, he opened his arms. Emily stepped into them without hesitation, wrapping her arms around his solid frame. The leather of his jacket was warm from the sun, familiar against her cheek. "I'm proud of you, kid," Jack said roughly, his voice muffled against her hair. "Always have been." Emily squeezed tighter for a moment, breathing in the familiar mix of leather and motor oil that had meant safety since she was small. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright, but her smile was steady. "I'll call when I land in Boston," she said, picking up her suitcase. "And again when I get to London." Jack nodded, his hands dropping to his sides. He watched as she joined the last few passengers boarding the train, her steps sure and purposeful. Just before she stepped through the doors, she turned back, giving him one last wave. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the train began to move. Jack stood on the platform, watching until it disappeared around the bend, carrying his daughter toward her chosen future. Not an escape, but a journey forward. Previous scene. Emily reveals she's leaving temporarily, not forever, and hugs him goodbye. "We've got a few minutes," Emily said, glancing at the station clock. "Want to sit, like old times?" Jack nodded, and they settled onto the familiar metal bench. The morning bustle continued around them, but in their small corner of the platform, time seemed to slow. The bench was cold beneath them, just as it had been days ago when Emily first asked him to stop. Emily smoothed her skirt, a gesture Jack recognized from when she was young, a habit she'd developed during difficult moments. "Remember when you used to bring me here to watch the trains?" she asked, her voice soft with memory. "Every Saturday?" Jack replied, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "You'd count the cars as they went by." 117 was the record, Emily said, smiling. "I was so determined to break it." The morning sun caught the silver threads in Jack's hair as he turned to look at her. "You always were stubborn. Wonder where you got that from." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that comes easily between people who know each other's stories by heart. "You know what I remember most?" Emily's eyes followed a pigeon strutting across the platform. "The way you'd sit here with me after school when things got too loud. You never asked questions, never tried to fix everything. You just stayed." Jack's throat tightened. Those afternoons were etched in his memory, too. His daughter, overwhelmed by the world, finding peace in their shared silence. "Seemed like what you needed." "It was." Emily's hand found his, squeezed gently. "Still is, sometimes." A train whistle sounded in the distance, but neither moved. The morning light painted long shadows across the platform, and for a moment, Jack could see the ghost of his younger self sitting there with a small girl in pigtails counting train cars. "I learned to be still here," Emily continued, her voice thoughtful. "Watching those trains come and go, I figured out that movement isn't always progress, and staying isn't always surrender." Jack nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for more words. The platform had been their refuge, their classroom, their quiet corner of the world where a former Hell's Angel and his daughter could just be. "The station's barely changed," Emily observed, looking around at the worn wooden boards, the faded paint, the ancient schedule board that still clicked when it updated. "Some things shouldn't," Jack replied, his voice rough with emotion. They sat in comfortable silence, shoulders touching, as commuters hurried past. The morning sun warmed their faces, and the familiar rumble of approaching trains vibrated through the bench. It was a moment suspended in time, father and daughter sharing space as equals, each carrying their own strength, their own choices. The station speaker crackled to life. "Final boarding call for express service to Boston, Track 3. Final boarding call." Emily straightened, but didn't immediately stand. "Thanks, Dad, for everything." "Thank you," Jack replied, the words carrying the weight of all they'd been through. "For showing me what real courage looks like." The conductor's whistle pierced the morning air, sharp and insistent. Around them, the last few passengers hurried toward the train doors, their footsteps echoing across the platform. Emily stood, gathering her bag with practiced grace. Jack rose beside her, his movements slower, more deliberate. Around them, the platform had nearly emptied, with only a few stragglers rushing toward the waiting train. "You've got everything?" Jack asked, his eyes scanning her luggage out of habit, the protective father in him still checking for forgotten items. "Everything that matters," Emily replied, adjusting the strap of her shoulder bag. She paused, then reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is for when you get home. Just don't read it here, okay?" Jack took the envelope, his rough fingers careful not to bend the corners. He slipped it into his jacket, close to his heart, and nodded. The weight of it felt like a promise. The train's engine hummed, a steady vibration that traveled through the wooden planks beneath their feet. Emily took a step toward the nearest door, then turned back. In her eyes, Jack saw the same quiet strength he'd always admired, but now it was fully her own. "I'll call when I land," she said, her voice steady. "And Dad, don't worry about riding slow on the way home. Some roads are meant to be taken at your own pace." Jack's throat tightened, but his smile came naturally. "Be safe, Emily." She climbed the steps into the train car, her movements sure and purposeful. Through the window, he watched as she found her seat, settled in, and turned to face him. She raised her hand in a small wave, and Jack lifted his in return. The conductor's final whistle cut through the morning air. The doors slid closed with a pneumatic hiss, sealing Emily inside. Jack stood perfectly still, his boots planted firmly on the platform where they'd shared so many moments. As the train began to move, Jack didn't feel the usual urge to turn away, to mount his bike and outrun the ache of goodbye. Instead, he watched the cars roll past, each one carrying his daughter further from him, but somehow bringing them closer than they'd been in years. The morning sun caught the train's windows, reflecting gold and then silver as it picked up speed. Emily's window passed, and he caught one last glimpse of her smile. Not sad, not fearful, but full of the quiet joy that comes with choosing your own path while keeping your roots intact. The train's whistle sounded again, more distant now, as it curved around the bend. Jack remained on the platform, watching until the last car disappeared and the tracks stretched empty before him. The rumble faded to a whisper, then to silence. In that silence, Jack felt something unexpected settle over him. Not the heavy weight of loss he'd carried so many times before, but a lightness, like laying down a burden he hadn't known he was carrying. Emily wasn't running from his past. She was building her own future. And in letting her go, he'd finally learned to trust the strength he'd helped her find. The morning breeze carried the scent of diesel and distant rain. Jack touched the envelope in his jacket, feeling its edges through the fabric. He didn't need to read it yet to know what it meant. Some words were better saved, like the quiet moments between stations, like the peace that comes from knowing love doesn't measure distance in miles. He turned toward the parking lot where his bike waited, his steps unhurried. The platform felt different now. No longer a place of partings, but a point of connection. A reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay still long enough to let love show you the way forward. The motorcycle's engine purred beneath Jack as he guided it along the familiar curves of the back road home. The late morning sun warmed his shoulders, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to outrun its rays. Each mile marker passed more slowly than usual, but the weight in his chest had lifted, replaced by something that felt remarkably like peace. He downshifted around a gentle bend, the bike responding smoothly to his touch. The sound of the engine echoed off the trees lining the road, a steady rhythm that matched his calm heartbeat. This was the same route he'd taken yesterday, the same worn asphalt he'd traveled countless times. But today it felt different. Fields stretched out on either side, golden with late summer wheat. Jack noticed details he usually blurred past. A red-tailed hawk circling overhead, the way sunlight caught morning dew on fence posts, the gentle sway of grass in the breeze. His usual iron grip on the handlebars had relaxed, his shoulders loose and easy. A truck passed in the opposite direction, the driver lifting 2 fingers in a casual wave. Jack returned the gesture, something he rarely did before. The envelope Emily had given him pressed against his chest, tucked safely in his jacket pocket. He resisted the urge to pull over and read it now. Some moments deserved their proper time and place. The old Peterson farm appeared on his right, its weathered barn standing straight against the sky. Jack remembered how Emily used to point at the horses in the pasture when she was small, her tiny finger tapping against his back as they rode past. Today, a young foal pranced alongside its mother, their manes catching the light. As he approached town, Jack didn't tense up as he usually did. The familiar storefronts and parked cars didn't feel like threats anymore, just parts of a community he'd kept at arm's length for too long. He slowed at the main intersection, nodding to Mrs. Chen as she swept the sidewalk in front of her grocery store. She smiled and waved, not a trace of fear or judgment in her expression. The bike's shadow stretched out ahead of him, leading the way down streets he'd always treated like escape routes. Now they were just roads, paths that connected places and people, nothing more or less. The engine's rumble felt different, too, less like a warning and more like a steady heartbeat carrying him forward. His house came into view around the final corner. The small white structure sat back from the road, morning glories climbing the mailbox post. Jack guided the bike into the driveway, the familiar crunch of gravel under his tires welcoming him home. He let the engine idle for a moment, its warm vibration familiar against his legs. The sound echoed off the garage door before he cut the ignition, leaving only the tick of cooling metal and the distant song of birds. Jack swung his leg over the seat, boots finding solid ground beneath him. His hands moved to the zipper of his leather jacket, pulling it down with careful deliberation. The weight of Emily's envelope shifted against his chest as he shrugged the jacket from his shoulders. Each movement was measured, unhurried. There was no need to rush anymore, no shadows to stay ahead of. The leather creaked softly as he removed it completely, the morning air cool against his arms. He draped the jacket over the bike's seat, his fingers lingering on the worn material that had protected him through so many miles. Inside, the house felt different. Sunlight streamed through windows Jack usually kept shuttered, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. His boots echoed on the hardwood floor as he crossed to the small key hook by the door, a gift Emily had given him years ago, though he'd rarely used it before. The metal hook gave a soft ping as he hung the motorcycle keys. They swayed gently, catching the light. Jack stared at them for a moment, remembering all the times he'd simply stuffed them in his pocket, always ready for a quick escape. Today, they looked right hanging there, like they belonged. He moved through the living room, noting the familiar scents of leather and motor oil that had seeped into the walls over the years. A stack of motorcycle magazines sat unopened on the coffee table, their glossy covers collecting dust. Emily's high school graduation photo smiled at him from its frame on the mantel. She'd insisted on wearing her leather jacket over her gown, a quiet tribute to their shared life. The kitchen floor creaked under his weight as he entered. Morning light poured through the window above the sink, illuminating the simple space. Coffee cups from yesterday still sat in the drain board, evidence of his rushed departure. He'd left in such a hurry, convinced that speed and distance were the only answers he had left. His eyes drifted to the kitchen table, solid oak, scarred from years of use. It had been Emily's homework spot, his late-night thinking perch, their shared breakfast counter on countless mornings. A white envelope lay in the center, placed with careful precision. He hadn't noticed it earlier in his rush to reach the station. The paper was cream-colored and thick, the kind Emily always chose for important messages. His name was written on the front in her neat handwriting. Not Dad or Daddy, just Jack. Something about that choice made his throat tighten. She'd addressed him as an equal, acknowledging the man he'd become, rather than just the role he'd played. Jack pulled out a chair, the legs scraping softly against the floor. He sat down heavily, his hands resting on either side of the envelope. The morning light caught its edges, making them glow. This wasn't a goodbye letter. He knew that now. It was something else, a continuation of the conversation they'd started at the station. His weathered fingers traced the edge of the envelope, feeling the quality of the paper. Emily had always paid attention to details like that, choosing materials that carried meaning beyond their practical purpose. Like the key hook by the door, not just a place to hang keys, but an invitation to stay, to make a home, to stop running. The envelope waited patiently in the pool of sunlight, promising words he hadn't yet read. Jack felt no urge to tear it open hastily. Like the slower ride home, like the keys hanging by the door, this moment deserved its own time. Their story wasn't ending. It was transforming, becoming something new but no less precious.